I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing you to Cliff Mayotte and Erin Vong. And so they are coming from Voice of Wonder. And I'm so excited about, sorry, Voice of Witness. And I'm so excited about this particular conversation because it's oral history projects are something that I've always heard about. I've always been inspired to try out. But now that there is an organization that is devoted to bringing oral history into classes, I saw it on Twitter and I was like, yes, this is a wonderful opportunity to bring them to the podcast. So, welcome, Cliff and Erin.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be with you and to talk about education and oral history.
Yeah, we're so excited to be here.
Would you please both talk about Voice of Witness and your role in Voice of Witness?
Yeah, perhaps I can say a few things about Voice of Witness, and then Erin and I can talk about our respective roles. Voice of Witness is a nonprofit organization based in San Francisco, California, otherwise known as Alone Land. And we are a nonprofit that amplifies the voices of people who have been directly impacted by and are fighting against injustice. And we do that through two main programs that we have: our oral history book series, which at this point we are up to, I think it's 22 books. And these are oral history collections that focus on everything from migration, displacement, the US criminal justice system, and more. And I just wanted to highlight, just to give you an example of our books, our two latest books. This one is called Mi Maria, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico. This came out this last year. And also Unheard Voices of the Pandemic, which we're all currently experiencing right now. And it was really an opportunity for us at Voice of Witness to reach out to narrators from previous books and to talk to them about how the pandemic and how COVID is impacting them right now. So these are just two examples of our most recent books. So that's kind of an example of our book series. And also our education program, we're really focused on sharing our approach to oral history, which we describe as ethics-based and empathy-driven, with classrooms and communities all over the world, virtually and in person. And we create curriculum, free downloadable curriculum for all the books in our series, which I just mentioned. And we have a host of free downloadable oral history resources for teachers that can be downloaded. And Erin can say a little more about it, but we also have a lot of resources related to using oral history and supporting language learners and multilingual learners. So that's just a brief intro to Voice of Witness, but I'll let Erin take over from here.
Yeah, and I think Cliff forgot to mention he is our education program director, and
Oh,
he
yeah.
really founded our education program. So we're so grateful to have Cliff. And I'm the education specialist. So I spend most of my days working directly with teachers and students and community advocates and researchers and anyone who's interested in learning about our oral history process. And it's not just necessarily about learning how to create a project, but it's also how our methodology informs their own work, even if that's an entirely different field. We found that oral history can really be used in any way, like as a doctor, in the way you talk to your patients and you listen to your patients, you can bring that oral history practice into that room with them. So our education program is just focused on expanding beyond what we love, which is the literary aspect of oral history, but it's giving people the opportunity to do what they want and just focus on that experience of talking to someone. And then what comes after that is really up to you.
It seems like Voice of Witness is like a one-stop shop for teachers who want to do the literacy part, but also like, hey, how do I incorporate this into the curriculum? Oh, wait, we already have lessons for you. We already have all the resources. We already have the documents. So here you go. Because teachers, when they hear about ideas like this, they're like, oh my goodness, I want to do it. And then they're like, wait, how do I do it? And so you've really provided the steps to guide us through that process. What was the start of this organization?
Well, first of all, Erin, thank you for reminding me of my job description and like actually what I do at Voice of Witness. Um, But Voice of Witness has been a nonprofit for about 12 years now, and it started as a book series, which was originally published by McSweeney's Books in San Francisco, beginning in 2004. And our co-founder, Mimi Locke, was instrumental in creating the nonprofit Voice of Witness that now exists. And so this was in 2008. And I joined the organization in 2010, and we've been building and building and building and creating and collaborating ever since then. And so, as you mentioned, we have a real, we like to think of ourselves as the go-to for oral history in classrooms and communities, and also really thinking about oral history and social justice and really what it means to amplify stories that might not otherwise be heard, and what that means and how you approach that with sensitivity and humility and respect, and how we nurture that in the classroom. So that's kind of the very, very brief history of the organization Voice of Witness.
Can you each please share a story about working with students or teachers related to oral history that has really shaped your practice today?
I'll jump in. So I've worked with English language learners and multilingual learners pretty much my entire career, and I'm a multilingual learner myself. And so a big thing I found over my years of teaching was that we really view language learners as having a deficit rather than an asset. And we really focus on the lack of English rather than the fact that they communicate in multiple languages and they bring all of that to the table. And so oral history has been this beautiful way of really highlighting all of those skills. And one defining project we've had at Voice of Witness is an oral history cookbook project that we did with a middle school here in San Francisco. The classes were all English language development classes. So these are students that come in with 1, 2, 3 other languages that they speak at home. And we had them interview someone in their lives about a recipe that's really important to them. And we talked about, what food and culture and cooking means to them and means to other people. And I think the shining moment wasn't actually from the students, who were all amazing, of course, but the shining moment was actually from a parent, a mom who was interviewed by her child for this project. And she came to us and she was speaking in Spanish, but she was saying that she had never felt so involved in her child's education before because, we live in San Francisco. English is the dominant language here. She didn't have that much access. But this time we had her child go interview her in Spanish and bring that into the classroom, and we translated it to English and we had this whole thing, but it meant she could really be part of her learning and she could share her own experience as part of that learning. And so she was an expert and given that opportunity. And so I think that's just a moment I always hold on to of why we do oral history and what it means to us.
Yeah, I just have a quick story that connects to that. One of the projects that we've been it's kind of ongoing for us at Voice of Witness is we're doing a lot of intergenerational storytelling and intergenerational oral history, and we've been working with an organization in San Francisco called Sequoia Living, which runs a series of public assistance housing for seniors in San Francisco, and connecting the residents at Sequoia Living with students at local middle and high schools. And I think I just wanted to highlight one of the things that Erin was mentioning around, the opportunities for students and residents to communicate stories of family and culture and community and language. And certainly with the intergenerational piece, there's this feeling that they both have a lot to teach each other. And they feel that because there's a lot of family connections. And it doesn't mean that grandparents and aunties and uncles always have an easy time talking to each other. But it's a real skill to develop. And sometimes when you're talking to an elder that you're meeting for the first time, I think that paves a way for a lot of storytelling in families and communities that is really necessary and crosses a lot of cultural and language boundaries and places. And we're hearing lots of stories and intergenerational stories in several different languages around San Francisco, which, as Erin mentioned, is an incredibly diverse cultural place, in the United States.
After doing about 100 podcasts, that's like the single red thread that goes throughout all the podcasts. All the experts that have been on talking about different things in the field, they've always talked about moving from the deficit mindset to an assets-based mindset, and talking about what you both have talked about, giving that example of parents being part of the school, regardless of their language. And actually, their language and their cultures are assets in which can enrich the child's learning experience. And so if we believe that it takes a village to raise a child, then that village shouldn't just be school and home. It should be together in a partnership. And really, I think oral history projects or oral history units are one of the best tools to make that happen. So would you share, you already shared an example, would you share another example of oral history projects?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. It's actually, I think I'll share the one that we talked about in our Edutopia article, which was how you found us, but I'll expand on it a bit more, especially because it's so accessible for multilingual learners. But in that article, we briefly talked about the artifact interview. And it's when we ask students to bring in an object that is meaningful to them to the classroom. And if they don't have it, they can always bring a picture or draw something, but we really ask them to pick a physical object because especially for language learners, it grounds the interview in a way that like, tell me about your life story is really unwieldy for even a native speaker to address. So the artifact interview is just a great entry point into the process of oral history interviewing. And so in this project, you can take it a lot of different ways, but the sort of classic way that we've done it is having those students bring in the object. Of course, we scaffold before with community guidelines for figuring out how to talk to each other, how to be comfortable sharing stories together. And then students pair off and you can either have them write questions ahead of time, you can have them journal first about their object to give their partner some ideas, or you can always give them a list of questions that they can use as jumping off points. And then they really just have conversations with each other about this object. And what happens naturally is that they talk about the object, but then they talk about where did it come from? Who gave it to me? What is my relationship with them? Why did I bring it today? What do I hope is going to happen to it in the future? Who's going to take it later? And it just spirals into this beautiful, snapshot of their life, even though it's just one specific object. And so from there, after they do these interviews, we usually ask students to jot down some quotes that they heard from the interview. So they might be writing as their partner is talking, but we make it clear that they're listening, they're just trying to capture it. Or they might, just ask, oh, can you repeat that? I actually want to write that down. And then we have the students actually write up sort of like a little museum display card of what that object is, what they learned from their partner about it, why did that person bring it in? And then we do a gallery walk. So we actually just display the objects and then the students can see what everyone brought in and then read a little more about it, including ideally some quotes from that student about why they chose that object today.
But Cliff, before you go to sharing your example, I just love this example because there's reading, writing, speaking, and listening all integrated together. It's not just saying, like, we're not just, okay, kids, we're going to have a separate vocab lesson, and then we'll do a separate reading lesson, and then we'll do a separate writing lesson. It's all really integrated together. I guess in the field, we call that swirling, where students are speaking, writing, interacting, reading, and listening to each other. And so, it's all authentic. Like, we're not doing a reading we're not doing a reading worksheet. We're actually reading our writing that's going to be on that museum, that write-up, right? And we're revising because it's not just because we have to, because we want to make sure we present that in the best way. So it's really, you're giving us a structure that integrates all language domains, that develops students' literacy, but is also culturally and sustaining and relevant to students.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on to what Erin was saying and what you were saying as well is that I think the cultural relevance piece is really important and goes across all of the projects that we want to support in that, whether it's the artifact interview that Erin was describing and how that can morph into all kinds of different kinds of projects and different ideas, but it's kind of reinforcing the idea that a student's lived experience and who they are and their culture and their background and their language becomes a central part of the curriculum. So they are seen and heard, and we were talking about the asset-based approach to learning, and I think oral history really, really supports that through the activity and the project that Erin was describing. And I think that that's really, really crucial. The other thing I wanted to add, without necessarily like going into fully another project, is that I think oral history and the artifact interview and the things that we were describing kind of ask students to talk about and describe, regardless of their background and where they are, is like, what's important to you? And to honor that and to see that and to incorporate storytelling as a part of that process. And the only other thing I wanted to add to that is that recently, through several projects, we've been able to collaborate with organizations and incorporate photography into the oral history process as well, and look at visual art and visual literacy, and kind of communicating that way as well, and how both oral communication and visual communication and visual literacy can talk to each other. And it's not necessarily dependent on a quote unquote academic fluency. It's really develops that in ways that are, I think, personal to each student and each project.
So I can see it as multimodal. So I can see this project as, I'm just, my mind is like growing with all these ideas of what to do. For example, with that museum display, students can then also take that display and then turn it into a podcast where they can read the podcast, but now there's a link in the podcast to the video album, so the photo album, where there's all these photos of the artifacts are there, and so it's just really integrated in multimodal and multimedia. There's a dimension of multimedia inside of it, so it's teaching kids to be literate in different ways, and it's not just the typical academic literacy that we think about. Cliff, is there an example that you want to share, or you don't have to?
No, I think we've kind of covered that. But I think, I did want to mention something about, this idea around academic literacy and kind of how the work that you do and the work that we're doing at Voice of Witness, I think is a real, I think a counter to that and an alternative to that, in that I think for us, I think literacy is the communication of thoughts and ideas, regardless of how that's expressed and where it comes from, and what medium and how it takes place, as opposed to a very traditional, very academic, very standard approach to literacy. But I think, yeah, I could talk about lots of different projects, but I think we've covered a couple of examples already. So I think I'm good.
Got it. Thank you. So let's talk about describing the process of designing an oral history unit.
Yeah, so I think teachers really like to start with the fun part of it, which is the final product, but we really have to start several steps behind. And I do sort of a back and forth between starting steps and end product, because thinking about the end product is really exciting and gets you engaged. But the very beginning is really focused on what we talk about as community guidelines, and making students feel safe and brave enough to share their own stories and to be ready to listen to other people's stories. We don't usually think about preparing someone to listen, but we do actually have to scaffold those skills and help students feel ready to capture those moments and to make the most of that interview experience. So the very beginning is really focused on talking to students and figuring out, what do they need to feel safe and brave and comfortable? How do they feel about the consenting process? How do they feel, students, especially when they're younger, they feel like they have so little power in their lives, and so much of their lives are dictated for them. And the oral history process is meant to unravel that a bit. And we're trying to give that power back to the people who are sharing with us. And so it's really talking with students about, what does that look like for you? What do you need from us as a class all together? And then what can we bring out into the world as we're doing these interviews? And then from there, you can go do the fun part of thinking, what do I want my project to look like? And this is where I really encourage teachers to come up with a type of theme, because it's, we have the luxury of a lot of time when we're creating our books. They take several years to come together. And so we have lots of time to actually capture someone's birth to now story. And we don't really have that much time in a classroom in a semester or a quarter. So I really encourage teachers to think about a theme about what they want to interpret through oral history, and this can be like the cookbook project, which I am completely in love with. And I always encourage teachers to do it because talking about food is amazing. But it can also be about stories of migration and just how did we all end up in this neighborhood together? How did we all end up in this classroom together? Or it's about cultural traditions or childhoods and what we remember about that. And this is really the point where you can engage students and ask them, what do you want to see in an oral history project? What do you want to learn more about? And we touched on this about the youth participatory action research projects in our article, and having students come up with these subjects that they want to learn more about and using that as the focus of oral history. And so after we've come up with our beautiful theme, that's when you start thinking about the medium you want your project to take place in. And as I mentioned before, the beauty of us teaching our methodology is that it doesn't have to look like our books. It can look like a podcast, which is really popular right now. It can look like a photo essay, as Cliff had mentioned. It can look like the cookbook. It can look like the museum gallery walk. And it can just be students presenting to class together. It's up to you and what you think is interesting and feasible for your students. So now that you've come up with some community guidelines, you've come up with the theme and the medium you want it to take, this is where all of those wonderful free resources we have will come in handy, because it will walk you through the process of teaching students to create and ask good questions and what that process looks like. And we have, lots of modeling activities where you can bring someone in and display for students what it's like to be an interviewer. And this is where you can exaggerate the process of like, can you tell me more about that? Oh, you mentioned this. Can you tell me more about them? And it's those moments that they pick up on, and then they'll remember when they go do their own interview. Oh yeah, I should ask another question about that. So we have all of those activities involved. And then from there, it's just a matter of getting that interview experience done, which some students will take some time to do, but then it's turning that into whatever that final medium you had decided on. And then you've done a whole project. It seems really unwieldy when you're just thinking about that final product, but the small steps are actually quite simple. It does just take a little time.
Yeah, that was going to be the other question of talking about, hey, how do we scaffold this oral history project? But you've really given us that scaffold of like, don't just think about the final product. Think about all the steps to get there. And let's start first with consent, and then moving to all the other steps to get there. And as you were saying it, it seems like in my head, I was thinking, I wonder if they have a book. I know you have resources, but is Voice of Witness going to have a book like a professional development book for teachers to read and learn more about this?
Well, we actually have several already. We have, and this is downloadable from our website. One of them is called The Power of the Story, the Voice of Witness Teacher's Guide to Oral History. We also have a wonderful oral history resource guide for English language learners that Erin put together that is free and downloadable from our website. And for older students and for other classrooms and communities, we have a book called Say It Forward, a guide to social justice storytelling. So there are several, and it kind of, there's a gradation between, grade level, and they're all, everything in all these resources that I mentioned they're fully adaptable. And we know that teachers and educators and students and community members that we want them to adapt our work and make it work for them. And we really think of it as a dialogue between educators and students. And I just wanted to highlight one or two things that Erin mentioned, and that's the mentioned before about designing an oral history project. One of the things that Erin mentioned was kind of, well, there's the final product and there's like where you start. And a lot of teachers work with like a backwards design or starting with the beginning. And I think the design that Erin was describing is two directional. And hopefully these two designs meet in the middle in a very elegant place. And so you feel like you're taking care of students and taking care of community members in the process, and students' own process, and kind of what that final project would be. But I also wanted to highlight one other thing that Erin mentioned, which was about there's an interaction with community members. There's an interaction with the public in a community, and part of this process, and what's really, I think, vital for students is what might those participants get out of that project? And what's in it for them, and where is the mutual benefit for them? And there's some really powerful teaching and learning that goes with that. And I just wanted to make sure that I was able to mention that.
So this really dovetails in really well to what's the case for oral history projects?
Yeah. So for us, oral history is really about communication, critical thinking, and I think above all, confidence and teaching students that confidence in themselves and in reaching out to people and learning about what it means to experience someone else's story and that empathy that builds from it. And so we think about teaching skills by empowering students to become interviewers and be their own narrators and take control of their own stories and help others take control of their own stories as well. And, I can make the case in terms of academic skills of literacy, reading, writing, speaking. All of that happens in the oral history process, but it happens in this beautifully organic way that doesn't feel forced for students. And I actually had a kid a couple years ago, as we were going through the project, he was like, wait, are we learning English now? And I was like, yes, we've been doing that this whole time. And he was so confused because he wasn't just getting a worksheet over and over. And we were like, no, it's happening. It's happening right now. And so it's, especially for multilingual learners, oral history just promotes that level of communication that I don't think they see when they're just looking at grammar and rules and practicing sentence structure over and over, because that's not really the point of what we want out in the real world. We want them to be able to talk to people as it comes to them. And the more they talk to people, the better they're going to get over time.
Oh, Erin, you sound like an experienced educator. And yes, that's the purpose of, I think, as we are decolonizing as language specialists, we are decolonizing English instruction to not just saying English only, to now saying multilingualism. And now this brings in SEL. Now this also brings in culturally responsive instruction. This brings in culturally sustaining instruction, where it's saying like what Cliff said before, students' lived experiences. Students' lived experiences are valuable. And when we start with what they know, it becomes immediately relevant to them. So I feel like oral history projects just pull in all these frames and concepts, even project-based learning or service learning, and they all tie it all together in something that's meaningful. Because kids will say, "Oh wow, am I learning English?" You are. You are developing your literacy, but you're also using your first language to communicate to your mom and dad, or to sustain that language as you're interviewing them, right? And so it's not just learning English at the expense of their first language. It's learning English, sustaining their language, sustaining their cultural connections, and saying that, oh, I am valuable, just like everyone else. It seems like you have lots of experience working with teachers and students, and so you've seen things that make it successful and things that make it not successful. Would you talk about those things?
Yeah, this is also a running joke among staff, but I'm the type of person that pokes holes into plans all the time. And I'm always like, is that going to work? Are we really going to do it? But I find that actually helps projects become more successful because we've really thought through what are the pitfalls and challenges. And so I love this question. And I think the big thing for me and teachers who are especially just embarking on their first project is, let's not aim for perfection, and let's rethink how we define perfection, because the goal of the oral history project actually is not that final product. It is a beautiful thing at the end that we love to share, but the goal is the interview experience. We just want students to sit down with someone and talk to them and learn from them and develop that empathic connection with someone, and then take that back with them. And it doesn't really matter what that looks like in the end. I can't really say that because I do care a lot about how these projects end up and I want something shiny to show off. But really the point is that interview experience. It's not the cookbook at the end. It's not the podcast at the end. It is the fact that we asked a student to go out and find someone and listen to them, and they did it. And they asked them these beautiful questions, and they practiced their language learning, and they digested all that information, and now they have it. No matter what we do with that information at the end, they have it within them. So I think that my biggest advice for teachers is really don't aim for the final project perfection. aim for the core skill of interviewing and getting your student to that experience. Because once you've done that, I always say everything else is just the sprinkles on top.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the process. Absolutely all about the process, because all of the assessments, all of the evaluations, all of the things that we hear back and experience at Voice of Witness through the education program and working with teachers and students is, yeah, they love the cookbook and they love, the final product, but across the board, everyone communicates how amazing the experience was. Interviewing that grandparent, thinking about, my relationship to my community, thinking about my relationship to my school and how I articulate that and what that means to me. It's like, that is incredibly, incredibly valuable. And I think too, and teachers are wonderfully ambitious. And sometimes the other little bit of advice I would give is that sometimes when they're thinking about oral history projects for the first time, it becomes, it's way too ambitious, and we're going to do this and we're going to do this and we're going to like 13 other things, and it's just really hard to get to. And it's okay to just be modest and to start small and to think about process before product.
That's the central theme of learning, right? It's always thinking about process before product, because the product will be forgotten and placed away, but the process will always stay with you. So that's a great way to end the podcast, to talk about, through this process, what do you each want teachers to take away from oral history projects?
I think we've talked a lot about what the oral history process does for students. And I also want to say that, especially for us at Voice of Witness, a big part of our work is working directly with teachers. And, I'm always answering those emails. We're on social media, pushing out resources. And I want teachers to know that they're not alone trying to do these projects in the classroom. There are people like us. There are other organizations doing this work. There are people that want to support you. And so please reach out. Please use our resources and break them apart and edit them however you want to make it fit your classroom, and ask us for more and ask us for the support, and know that oral history is about community. It's about building community. And it's not just about building community for your students doing the project. It's about building community for you as an educator and getting to know each other through that oral history process and sharing your own experiences as well.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think oral history, really honors teachers' best impulses in terms of why they do what they do and how they do it and how they approach it. And we're really, really committed in supporting teachers in that and acknowledging that. And also this process, we want to acknowledge and encourage teachers that they are doing this work with their students and not just for them. And so they're active participants and modeling and doing all the things that we've been talking about over this, over this conversation. But I think really it's seeing teachers and honoring their impulses, for teaching and learning.
Well, Cliff, I can see the program director inside of you, especially when you went and you said that the process should be two-way process, not just a one-way. Because you talked about understanding by design or designing backwards planning. You really talked like a program, like a person who's an experienced educator and thinks about the holistic aspect of it. I want to ask you another question. I was just thinking about what brought both of you to a Voice of Witness.
Well, I had been a full-time classroom teacher for about 15 years. And I had been doing, my background is in literature and performing arts. And I had been doing a lot of performing arts, incorporating oral history and incorporating both around social justice themes. And I had gotten to a point where I'd been, I had enough of the classroom, like full time, and I wanted to transition out and to do something else. And so I was thinking about social justice and oral history and literature and storytelling and performance. And all of those things led me to Voice of Witness. It was a wonderful place for me to land after having been in the classroom for so long. So it felt like a very organic, wonderful journey that led me to Voice of Witness.
So as I mentioned before, I am a multilingual learner myself. I come from a refugee family, and so much of our story is not written down or is not even in objects because my family had to leave so much behind. And so oral history has always been a part of my life. And I don't think I've recognized it as such until I went abroad and I taught in the classroom for a few years in Spain. I taught English language to them. And I actually did use oral history without knowing what I was doing. I sort of look back and think, I wish I had Voice of Witness back then. And I did a version of an oral history project with them where I did encourage them to use their native language, which wasn't Spanish in that region. It was actually Galician. And I encouraged them to use that because I wanted to cultivate that acknowledgement of their other language on top of learning English with me. And then when I came back to the US, when I came back home to San Francisco, I really wanted to stay connected to my favorite parts of teaching. And I just sort of fell into Voice of Witness and the oral history process here and realized this is what I've always wanted to do. And now I've been here for 5-6 years and absolutely loving every moment that I get to be in the classroom with teachers and to develop these ideas and really expand the way we look at oral history.
Well, I'm grateful that your individual paths have brought you to Voice of Witness so that you can be working in an organization that produces all these resources for teachers. And every time someone creates an oral history project with your resources, you are there in the classes with them. So your work is still teaching. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us here.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure.